Lots of features were added already. Now I want to dive into query parameters. Query parameters are special parameters which you find on some URLs at the end of the URLs. On some URLs you have a question mark, and then thereafter you have parameter pairs, which basically pass extra data into the page that was loaded. The difference compared to regular route parameters, like our quote ID parameter, is that the regular parameters, like quote ID, are mandatory. So this quote detail page is only loaded if we have an ID, if we have this segment. Whereas query parameters are optional. The question mark thing here does not change the route matching. It has no impact on which route is matched. But whichever route is matched then has access to that query parameter data to, for example, change the behavior of the page that was loaded. And what could be a changed behavior? Well, for example, here on this quote list page here, we might want to implement sorting so that our quotes are sorted in ascending or descending order by ID and therefore by age, for example. For this, I'll first of all add such a sorting functionality, so some logic to sort the components. And then as a second step, I want to set and use query parameters to save the current sorting, so that we could share a link like this, which has some query parameters, and if another user uses that link, the quotes would automatically be sorted as we sorted them, so that we can save that extra bit of information on how the quotes should be sorted in ascending or descending order, that we can save this piece of information in the URL, and we do sort them accordingly if someone uses this URL. And if we use this URL without the query parameters, we get the default sorting. That's what I want to implement now. Now for this, I'll start here in this JSX code, in this fragment. Here I want to add a new div with a class name of classes.sorting. That's simply one of the predefined CSS classes you find in that CSS file, which was part of the starting project. And in that div, I just want to add a button, which should say sort, and then actually it will say sort ascending for now, but later this will be dynamic. So that if we are currently sorting in ascending order, this button says sort descending, because we would be switching to sorting in descending order, and vice versa. But for the moment, I'll hard code it. Then we want to add a click listener and fire a function when this button is clicked. For example, the change sorting handler function could be a function we define here, and then we point at this function here. And now the goal here is to change how we sort our quotes. Now for this, we could use state and then execute some code that sorts our quotes and update the state then and output our state quotes, so the sorted quotes down there. But I'll not do it like this. Instead, I want to work with query parameters. And one of the things I want to do here in this change sorting handler is I want to update the query parameters in the URL. So for the moment, I'll not sort yet, but I'll just update the URL so that we update this shareable URL. And for this, we can again import a hook from React Router. So from React Router DOM, I'll import a hook, and the hook I'll import is again the use history hook. Because you learned that this hook allows us to change the page history, it allows us to change the URL therefore, and we can use this hook and the history object it returns to add query parameters to the currently loaded page. For this, I'll just execute use history, and I'll get this history object. And now in the change sorting handler, we can call history push or replace, and I'll go for push so that we could use the back button to go back to the last sorting, to the URL before we changed it. And then here we can set our new path, and there I want to set it to /quotes because that's the page on which we are. And then I want to add a query parameter with a question mark and then sort and set this equal to some value. Now this key name is up to you, by the way. It doesn't have to be sort, but I will use sort as a key which holds my sorting information. And then I'll set a dynamic value here, which I derive on our current state. So if we're currently sorting in ascending or descending order. And we will later make this truly dynamic. For the moment, I'll always add ascending here. And therefore, of course, for the moment, we could also just use one hard-coded string. But soon this will be dynamic, and it will not always be ascending. Now, if we save this code like this, you will now see this button. And if I click this button, you see the URL changes and this query parameter is added. Now that's step number 1. Step number 2 is that we want to read that query parameter value and act accordingly. And then change the sorting, change the button label, and so on. Now reading query parameter values is also relatively straightforward, but we need to use yet another hook provided by React Router DOM, the useLocation hook, where useHistory gives us access to the history object, an object that allows us to change and manage the URL. useLocation gives us access to a location object which has information about the currently loaded page, about the currently loaded URL. So here we can call useLocation, and we get such a location object. And then for the moment, I'll just log location here, directly in the component function. And with this, if I open the DevTools, if I reload, we see this object. That's our location object. And here we see a bit of information. We see the path name, for example, of the page which was loaded. And we see this search property which holds our query parameter data. And that's very interesting. Also interesting is that if I click sort ascending, we see that this location object gets logged over and over again. So that means that pushing this page here actually re-renders this component. And that actually makes sense, because when we push a page, even if it's the page we're currently on, then this page component is re-evaluated because React Router sees that we changed the history, and it therefore re-renders the page which should be shown to us, even if it's the page we're currently on. And that's a useful mechanism which we will actually use to our advantage in a couple of minutes. So we got this location object which has this search property with the query parameter data. Now we can translate this into a JavaScript object, which is a bit easier to use for us than this plain string here, by instantiating a new URL search params object. And that's a built-in constructor function built into the browser. So this is not coming from React Router, not coming from React. This is a default JavaScript constructor function, a default JavaScript class, so to say, which we can use in the browser. Now, to this constructor, we can pass location.search. So this string here, including the question mark, this is now passed to that constructor. And that will then give us a nice query params object, an object where we can then extract our query parameters by key. So here, for example, I have the sort key with a value of ask. And because I'm using URL search params, this query params object will now have a sort key which will hold this ask value. And that's simply a more convenient way of extracting data from the query parameters. So now we can create a new helper constant, and we could name it is sorting ascending. And here we can now use query params, and there we can call a get method and get one of our query params keys, in this case sort. Sort because we have sort as a key here in our query params. This will then give us the value stored for that key in the query params, so in this case ASC, ask. And now we can check if that is then equal to ask here, and if that is equal, we know we are sorting in ascending mode because the query parameter has a value of ask. If the query parameter has a value different from ask, then this will be false because then we're not sorting in ascending mode. And now we can use isSortingAscending to, for example, make this button more dynamic. It should not always say sort ascending. Instead, depending on if we're currently sorting in ascending mode or not, it should say sort descending if we are sorting in ascending mode, because then clicking the button should switch to descending sorting. And only if we are currently sorting in descending order, clicking the button should switch to ascending order, so then it should say sort ascending. And I also want to make this dynamic now, how we change our URL. I don't always want to set the value of sort to ASC. Instead here, I want to check if sorting ascending, if that is true, which means we're currently sorting in ascending mode. And if it is true, I want to switch to descending mode, and only if it's false. So if we're not yet sorting in ascending mode, I want to switch to ascending mode. And with those changes made, if we save this, we see that if I now click this button, the URL changes and the button text also changes. The list does not yet change, but we are changing the query parameters. And now we can also use that to sort the list. Now for this, attached you find a sorting.js file, which contains a sort quotes function. You can simply add this function in your quote list component file before you define that quote list component function. So right after the imports, before I have my component function, I insert sort quotes. Now that's a little helper function, which will simply sort an array of quotes by ID. And then depending on whether we're sorting in ascending or descending order, the bigger or smaller IDs will be prioritized. And we can now call sort quotes to derive our, well, sorted quotes. For this here in this component function, we can get our sorted quotes by calling sort quotes whenever this component re-renders. And here we then pass in props.quotes, so the quotes we get through props. And as a second argument, sort quotes wants to know the order. It wants to know whether we want to sort in ascending or descending order, and it wants a boolean here. And here I'll therefore pass in isSortingAscending. And then sorted quotes can be used to actually output the quote items. So here I'll use sorted quotes instead of prop quotes. And since this component function will be re-executed whenever we change the query parameters, we will get new sorted quotes whenever the query parameters change. So with this, now if I reload, if I click sort descending, you see the order of my list items also changes. So now here we can sort, and now we get this reusable URL. And if I grab that URL, for example, in descending mode, and I share it with someone, that person also starts in descending mode. If I grab the URL and share it in ascending mode, that person also starts in ascending mode. So that's an example for using query parameters, and that's how we can work with them with React Router. Now we are nearing the end of this module. You might remember that on this quote detail page, we actually also had this comments feature. At the moment, we don't really have comments, but we do have this nested route. But currently, we can only reach this route by manually adding this comments path here at the end. Now, we might want to give the user a link that loads the comments or something like this. And that is something which we can implement indeed, something which we did do before already. Adding a link isn't too difficult, and therefore, of course, feel free to try this on your own. On the quote detail page, add a link below the highlighted quote, which will load the comments and navigate us to this path here. Here's a short pause for you to do this on your own, thereafter we'll do it together. So let's add this link now. For this, we need to import link from React Router DOM. And then here in highlighted quote, we can add a link. And actually, I will wrap this in a div with a class name of centered using this globally defined centered class here. And I'll then move my link into that div. But that's of course optional. Then this link could say load comments and hence lead to the current URL / comments. Now for this, I need to construct the destination dynamically because the quote ID is dynamic. It depends on which quote we loaded. So actually we can copy this code from down there because that's the path we want to navigate to. We want to load this route in the end. Now I will also give this link an extra class name. It's not something we did before, but we can add classes to the anchor tag which link renders by using the regular class name prop. And here I'm using a global class again, which is defined in that index CSS file. With all of that, if we save this, we got this load comments link here. And hence now if I go to a quote without / comments, if I click load comments, we see that. But maybe we also want to make that link disappear after we loaded the comments. Now we could try to implement this by looking at the URL and check whether we are on the comments page or not, but we don't have to do this ourselves. We can hand that work off to React Router. We can also move this here into a route, and that might be strange at first, but it is actually just embracing the functionality React Router gives us. We can add a new nested route here, and this nested route should be active if the path is this path, but without the comments. So if we're on the page without / comments, then this route should become active. And only then, so I will add the exact prop here so that we're not matching the beginning of a path, but the full path. Then I want to render this div, because we can render any JSX code we want for any route we define. Now with this change made, we don't see the load comments text if we are on / comments. But if I am on just the detail page, I do see load comments. But as soon as I click it, it disappears because we changed to the nested route. And I'm showing this to you because I want you to really play around with React Router and use its features. You can build something like this with help of nested routes. And this is a way of using this nested routes feature to conditionally render different content based on the URL without you having to manage some complex state. React Router does that for you. Now, React Router can help us with nested routes, as we learned. It also helps us with constructing paths like this and with navigating to more complex URLs. Currently, we're always manually building strings like this, and that works. But this approach has one downside. If we ever decide that we don't want to show our quotes under /quotes, but maybe just /quote, then we have to change this here in the route definition. And we have to change all our links, and that is something we will have to do. But when we work with nested routes like here, we also have to change it here in these route definitions. So we have to change it in a lot of places. And I will revert it here, but we would have to change it in a lot of places. And at least for those nested routes, that's unnecessary. Here, we could simply use the fact that React Router gives us certain hooks that allow us to find out for which URL this component was rendered, so that we don't need to repeat that URL, that path in the URL here. And for that, we can use another hook provided by React Router DOM. UseRouteMatch is the hook name. It's kind of similar to useLocation, but it has more information about the currently loaded route. Not just about the URL, but about some internally managed data React Router is aware of. We can simply call UseRouteMatch here, and we get such a match object. And let's simply have a look at this object first by logging it to the console. If we save that, if I open the DevTools, we get this kind of object. And what we see in here is that we get the path, but not the actual path in the URL, but the path as it was defined by us for React Router, including our placeholder. And this can sometimes be useful. We also get the params, which were found for this route, and we get the full actual URL. And that's now useful, because now we can use this match object to construct these nested route paths dynamically. Here, for this comments nested route, we can still create a string with a template literal, but we can inject a dynamic value here and use match.path here. So this path including the placeholder. We didn't do that before actually. We used a concrete value and that also worked, but we can also define this route with a placeholder because after all, this here is a route definition, not a link. So having a placeholder here is okay. We also have a placeholder here in the main quote detail route definition in app.js. So here we can then utilize this path. The same could be done here for this nested route which shows this load comments button. Here we can just use match path if we want to. With this, if I save and reload, we see the comments section for /comments and load comments otherwise. So we get the same behavior as before, but we don't manually have to create that string. Instead, we extract it from the existing route definition, which means that if we now change our root routes from /quotes to /quote, we don't have to adjust our nested routes. And that is a clear win. It's less work. Now we can also use useRouteMatch and this match object for this link here, because here I'm also constructing my full URL. And since I know that this should be a link to a nested route, I don't need to do that. Instead, we can inject match.url here and then just append /comments thereafter. With that, again, we have less work here, and we use the fact that we already are on a part of this page we want to link to. So with that, if I, again, go to a single quote, if I click load comments, I do load the comments successfully, but now we're using some convenience features offered by React Router, which ensure that we reuse existing knowledge and we don't have to hard code as much. Speaking of hard coding, the quote list component also has some hard coding here. We push /quotes and change the query params. This is also a bit redundant because we already are on /quotes, and we will always stay on /quotes. It's just about the query params here. So here we could also use route match if we want to, or use the existing location object, since here I'm only interested in the currently loaded path, and then not hardcode /quotes here, but instead use the current location path, which is the part after the domain, which is /quotes. So for this, we could change this code here a little bit and actually switch to a template literal, where I inject the result of this expression here, and where I start with another injected value where we have a look at location path. And then we add a /, and that's the only hard-coded text here. And then we add a question mark, sort equals, and then the value of this expression. And here that's actually path name, not path. Location has a path name property which holds the full current path with all the concrete values entered there. So now with that, if we are on /quotes, if we click this button, we again do change the query parameter, but we reduced the amount of hard-coded values. We can also change the location we push or we link to. Up to this point, we always worked with strings. Whenever we created a link, like here in quote detail, we in the end constructed a string. The same in our main navigation. We have strings here as destinations. And that is very common. But if you have more complex destinations, like here in quote list where query parameters are involved, You might be constructing very long strings and code could look like this. It's readable, but it could be more readable. And that's why React Router actually allows you to use an alternative description of the destination a link should lead to or this programmatic navigation should lead to. And I'll show it here at the example of programmatic navigation, but you could use the same kind of value for all your links. Besides using a string here, as we did thus far, you can also pass an object which describes the target destination. This object wants a path name, which is the path you want to navigate to, something like /quotes. Or in this case, simply location.pathname, since we want to stay on the current page. And then here, you can also add a search key. And that allows you to add query parameters. The search key simply wants a string where we still construct our query parameters as we do it here. So I'll copy that code and add it in this template literal here. But now we split our path and our query param part into two different properties. And this here is a bit more readable, I would argue. It's totally optional. You don't have to switch to this approach, but you may switch to it if you have more complex URLs you want to navigate to. And with that, if I save this, if I reload /quotes, this button still works. But now we made this a bit more readable. And that's another convenience feature offered by React Router.